The morning Della Marsh walked out of her barn and into the first pale light of a February that had already killed 3 men's hog operations along the Granger River. She was carrying a lantern in one hand and a feed pail in the other. And every last one of her 17 sows was alive, more than alive. They moved through the straw with the slow, deliberate weight of creatures that had eaten well and slept warm, and expected the same again tomorrow. Their breath rose in soft clouds in the frozen air. Their sides were round and tight, with piglets not yet born, and when Della counted them, touching each heavy flank with the flat of her palm, the way a woman checks the pages of an account book, she counted 17, and then she counted again, and the number did not change. 17 sows. 112 piglets promised in the bellies of those sows, give or take. In one of the worst winters anyone along the Granger could remember, on a farm the county assessor had called a marginal holding, on land her own father had described when he left it to her as more trouble than it's worth. It had worked. But that is the end of the story, and the end is always the wrong place to begin. 2 years earlier, in the autumn when the red sumac was still burning along the fence lines and the days were still warm enough to work without a coat, Della Marsh was 23 years old and the owner, by inheritance, of 40 acres of bottomland on the low side of the Granger River Valley. The land was not the desirable kind. The good farms in the valley sat on the high benches, where the soil was dark and deep, where the corn grew tall and the wheat came in clean, and where a man with a plow and some application could do respectably well. Della's 40 acres sat in the pocket where the river bent, a low bowl of ground that flooded in wet years and turned to cracked gray plates in dry ones, stubborn clay soil with a thin skin of topsoil worn nearly to nothing by the previous owner, who had tried wheat, and then corn, and then nothing, and then died with the note on the property, nearly paid, but the spirit of the enterprise thoroughly exhausted. He had been Della's father. She had nursed him through his last winter, and buried him in the spring, and then she had stood in the yard of the farmstead and looked at what remained. The house was sound. The well was good. There was a barn of reasonable size and a pig pen that had not held pigs in 4 years, its rails gray and loose. There was 40 acres of bottomland that no one had offered to buy at any price she was willing to accept. There was a debt of $60 to the Granger County Lending House, which was not a catastrophic debt, but was a real one, and there was not yet any visible means of paying it. Della had $22 in a tin box under her floor. She had her 2 hands and her father's tools, and the bottomland that everyone in Granger County agreed was more trouble than it was worth. What she did with all of that is the story. She spent the first weeks of that autumn doing the thing that came naturally to her, which was watching. Not idly, Della Marsh was constitutionally incapable of idleness, but watching with the same focused attention she had given, as a girl, to the way water moves through a field after rain, to the way certain plants root in certain soils and others don't, to the arithmetic of what a farm takes in and puts out, and where the quiet losses happen. She walked her 40 acres in the morning and in the afternoon. She noted where the ground held moisture longest, which was most of it. She noted that the willow scrub in the low corners was heavy and dark green, fed by something running underground. She noted that the cracked clay banks along the river bend were riddled with the smooth, mud-packed entries of holes she recognized. She knelt and put her face close to one and smelled the rich, animal warmth of it. She had read enough, her father had kept a small but serious library, to know what she was looking at. The bottomland, useless for grain, was excellent for something else. The question was what she would put on it. She had $22 to answer that question with. It was old Václav Horak who pointed her toward the squash. Václav farmed the 20 acres north of her property, land nearly as poor as hers, which he had worked for 30 years with a stubbornness that the valley people considered either admirable or absurd, depending on how good their own harvest had been. He was a small man with hands the color and texture of walnut bark, and he spoke English with a careful precision that made everything he said sound considered, because it was. He came over one afternoon in early October to return a borrowed adze, and he found Della sitting on the fence rail of the empty pig pen with a piece of paper and a stub of pencil, working numbers. He looked at the pen, and then at the paper, and then at Della, and he said, in his measured way, "The land tells you what it wants to grow. You only have to be quiet enough to hear it." She told him she thought the land wanted to grow pigs, but she had not yet worked out how to feed them through a winter on $22. He was quiet for a moment, which was his habit, and then he told her about the squash. There was a market gardener named Prosper Fenn who operated out of the river town of Alderton, 12 miles south. Every autumn Fenn brought his winter squash to market. Butternut, Hubbard, a thick-rinded blue-gray variety he'd developed himself. And every autumn a portion of it cracked in the wagon on the road from Alderton, or split under its own weight in the stacking, or showed a soft spot that made it unsellable to household buyers. These he sold by the load at the end of market day at whatever price he could get, because a cracked squash would not keep, and a squash that would not keep was worth nothing. Václav had bought a load the previous October for $11 and fed it through to his 4 sows and his boar across most of November. The pigs, he said, had taken to it like they'd been born eating squash, which in a manner of speaking the next generation had been, and they'd come through the early cold with more flesh on them than any winter before. And the squash, Václav added, had cost him less than the same weight in corn, and his bottomland clay was no kind of country for growing corn anyway. He looked at Della's pen rails. A pig operation, he said, suited low, wet land. The wallows that frustrated a corn farmer suited a pig just fine. She said, "I know it." He nodded once, as if that settled something, returned the adze, and walked home. Della drove to Alderton on the second Saturday of October with her wagon and her $22 folded in her coat pocket. Prosper Fenn was a large, sun-reddened man who sold his good squash at 5 cents apiece, by the piece or $3 per dozen for restaurant buyers, and who had, at the end of that day's market, a wagon bed heaped with 900 cracked and split and soft-spotted squash he could not sell and did not want to haul back. He wanted them gone. Della walked around the wagon once, the way she walked her 40 acres, looking. She picked up several squash. She pressed her thumbs into the soft spots and checked the color of the flesh inside the cracks, and checked how deep the rot went in the worst ones, and how shallow in the best ones. Most were structurally sound. The cracks were cosmetic damage from a rough road. The splits were mostly skin deep. She tallied in her head. Even accounting for the worst 20% being too far gone to use, she was looking at 720 squash in working condition. She went back to Prosper Fenn and said she would take the load for $12. He said he'd take 13. She looked at the wagon and looked at him and said 12. And there was something in her voice, not hard, but settled, the way good clay is settled. And he took the $12 and helped her load the wagon, and she drove back up the valley with 900 cracked squash and $10 remaining to her name. The town of Granger saw the wagon come through. A wagon, it should be noted, was difficult to make inconspicuous, and a wagon loaded high with split and damaged squash, driven by a young woman alone, was the kind of sight that drew comment as reliably as rain draws mud. The general verdict was delivered at the hardware counter of Ennis Boyle's dry goods store that same afternoon, where 3 farmers waiting on seed catalogs watched Della's wagon move past the window and arrived, collectively and without much deliberation, at the conclusion that she had finally broken under the weight of her situation. A woman alone, Boyle said, with that bottomland, and now she was buying rubbish. He said it with the particular pity that is the close cousin of satisfaction. The other two agreed in the agreeable way of men who have not had to work very hard to form an opinion. Della, who was not listening, drove her wagon home and began to do the arithmetic. She had 900 squash. She had $10. She had an empty pig pen that needed new rails on 3 sides, which she would cut and hang herself from the willow timber in the low corners of her property, which wanted thinning anyway. She needed pigs. The question of pigs was the arithmetic that kept her awake that first night, not from despair, but from the focused application she gave to any problem that had a solution waiting inside it. Shoats, young pigs weaned and ready, ran between $1 and $1.50 apiece at the Granger livestock pens. A breeding operation needed sows, not shoats, and good breeding sows of reliable stock ran $3 each at the low end, which was money she did not have after the squash and after the rail work. What she had was $10 and a pig pen she was building herself, and the question of how to start. She chewed on this for 3 days, and then she went to see Václav Horak again. What Václav told her, over coffee that tasted of chicory and good intention, was that his neighbor to the west, a man named Abner Collum, was liquidating his hog operation on account of a bad knee that had gone worse and his wife's insistence that they move to her sister's house in Topeka. Collum had 4 sows of middle age, 3 and 4 years, all proven breeders, that he needed to move before the end of the month. They were not young, they were not fashionable stock. They were large, heavy-boned Poland China crosses that Collum himself described when Della came to look at them as ridiculous animals, which Della took as a recommendation rather than a warning. The 4 sows stood in a muddy pen and regarded her with the kind of calm and faintly reproachful dignity that large animals often carry. The biggest one had a notch in her left ear that her previous owners had given her, and Della's neighbor's daughter, a 7-year-old named Bess, who had attached herself to the viewing expedition without being formally invited, immediately named this sow queen, and then named the other 3 in rapid succession, Agnes, Mud, and Persimmon. Della bought all 4 for $9.30, which left her 70 cents to her name, and she did not sleep much that night either, but for different reasons. Being almost out of money concentrates the mind. It also, if you are the kind of person Della Marsh was, clarifies the arithmetic considerably. She had 4 sows, she had 900 squash. She had 40 acres of bottomland and a barn and a pen and her own 2 hands. She had no room left for doubt, which turned out to be a useful condition. She spent November learning her sows. This is the part of the story that the people of Granger County would not have believed if they had been told it, because it did not look like work from the outside. It looked like a young woman standing in a pig pen for long periods of time, not doing anything obvious. What Della was doing was watching Queen and Agnes and Mud and Persimmon the way she had watched her 40 acres, noting the hierarchy among them, noting which one led and which ones followed, noting how they approached new feed and how long it took them to settle after a disturbance, and how they behaved in the cold, and what their dung told her about what they were digesting and how. The squash she fed in halves and then in quarters, mixing the pulp with the few cracked ears of corn she could afford from what remained of her neighbor's store, and she noted how they cleaned the rind and left nothing, noted how their coats thickened through November in a way that satisfied her to see, noted the beginning of the swelling in the bellies that meant the boar she had borrowed from Václav for a week in October had done his work. By December, she had 4 pregnant sows and approximately 600 squash remaining, which, by her arithmetic, would carry them to February if she managed the ration carefully. Carefully was a word Della Marsh understood down to the bone. The cold came in January with the particular malice of a cold that has been gathering itself for a long time. It came down from the north on a wind that found every gap in barn siding and turned the Granger River to iron in 3 days. The temperature dropped to 12 degrees below zero on the 15th of January and stayed there for a week. This was the cold that ended Harlan Teague's hog operation. which had been running at 200 head and was considered one of the most robust in the valley. Teague's pigs, fed on stored corn that had been priced out of his reach this year after a disappointing harvest, had gone into the cold season thin, and thin hogs do not survive 12 below zero in an uninsulated barn. And Teague's barn was not insulated because insulating a barn for 200 pigs was not the kind of expense a man considered when business was good. It was also the cold that reduced Ellis Boyle, son of the hardware counter Ennis Boyle, running his own small pig operation on the valley bench, to a loss of 11 of his 14 shoats. The cold did not discriminate by intention or by industry. It discriminated by fat. Della's sows were fat. This was the consequence of 600 squash fed with steady care across 2 months, of a barn she had spent October and November chinkling with river clay mixed with straw until the walls stopped breathing cold air, of deep straw banking around the base of the pen interior that she refreshed every 3 days. She had borrowed a pattern from Václav for a low Dutch hood over the water trough, a simple wood and canvas arrangement that kept the water from freezing solid and saved her from the labor of hauling hot water twice daily, and she had hung the whole interior with feed sacks along the north wall to break the draft. None of this was ingenious. All of it was attentive. The difference between Della's barn and Harlan Teague's barn, in the end, was not money. It was the number of times a person had stood inside it in November thinking about January. The sows farrowed in the last week of January and the first week of February. Queen went first, on a night so cold the lantern flame burned thin and blue, and she produced 11 piglets, of which 10 lived. Agnes followed 2 days later with 9, all 9 surviving the night. Mud, the smallest of the 4, surprised Della with 13, which caused Della to say something brief and feeling into the cold barn air, though she said it quietly and to no one in particular. Persimmon last gave 8. That was 41 piglets in 2 weeks, from 4 sows, in the coldest January the Granger River Valley had recorded in 11 years. Bess, the 7-year-old neighbor child who had materialized at the barn door on the night of Queen's farrowing, and subsequently appeared every morning before school and every afternoon after it, named every piglet, all 41 of them. Della did not discourage this. She had noticed, in the weeks since Bess began appearing, that the girl had a steadiness around the animals that was unusual in a child, and that the sows settled faster when she was in the pen, and that Bess's naming, whatever else it accomplished, meant that Della could say Agnes's third one, the big spotted one, and Bess would say Pearl, and they would both know immediately which pig they meant, which turned out to be practically useful. February passed, and the cold broke in the first week of March with the abruptness of a door swung open, and suddenly there was mud and snowmelt, and the smell of the river running again, and 41 piglets growing at the astonishing rate that young pigs grow when they are warm and well fed. Václav came over and looked at the pen for a long time, and then said, in his deliberate way, a thing Della would remember. He said, "People look at a pig, and they see mud and smell, and a worthless creature. But a pig is the most practical animal God ever made. A pig turns nothing into something. All it asks is that you pay attention." He looked at the 41 piglets and nodded once, the way he had nodded when she said she knew the bottomland suited pigs. He had been saying the same thing about her from the beginning, though neither of them named it. Word moved through Granger County the way word always moved, which is to say, quickly and with embellishment. The embellishment in this case was that Della Marsh had 41 pigs she had raised through the coldest winter in recent memory on rotten squash she'd bought for nothing, which was almost exactly true and therefore more surprising than any invention. It was known that Teague had lost most of his operation. It was known that Ellis Boyle had lost 11 shoats. It was known, therefore, that there was a shortage of pork along the Granger, and that the shortage would be felt come summer and felt hard come autumn. It was in this context that a man named Calvin Greer arrived at Della's farm on a Wednesday in late March, driving a good buggy and wearing a coat that cost more than her $60 note. Calvin Greer bought pigs for the Alderton packing concern. He drove the valley every spring, and in ordinary springs he had his choice of stock. This was not an ordinary spring. He came up Della's lane with the easy confidence of a man who has always had his choice. And he looked at her farm with the particular look of a man who expects to find disorder and plans to use it. He was not unkind exactly. He was the variety of man who has learned to make business sound like charity, which is its own kind of unkindness. He walked along her pen rails and looked at the 41 piglets and the 4 sows, who regarded him from a sociable distance. And he said the stock looked reasonable, all things considered, though of course the breeding was not fashionable, and the bottomland operation was a challenge, and someone in her position, here he paused with the precision of a man who has measured his pauses. Someone operating alone on a second-year farm would do well to move stock while the moving was good and not hold out for prices that the market couldn't support. He offered her $2 a head for the 41 piglets, payable in 30 days. Della had been leaning on the pen rail, listening the way she listened to everything, fully and without hurry. She was quiet for a moment after he finished. Then she said, "What's the Alderton market price for shoats right now?" It was not quite a question. She had already learned the price from Václav, who had a son-in-law in Alderton who wrote letters. Greer said the market was soft, which was the thing a buyer always said. Della said the market she'd heard about was $3.75 per head and rising because of the winter losses, and she watched his face. There was a moment, very brief, when something moved across Greer's expression, a recalibration, and then the easy confidence settled back, but it was a different kind now, flatter and more careful. He said she had heard wrong. She said she supposed she might have, and asked him how he'd known the count was 41, since she hadn't mentioned it. Greer went quiet. He had counted through the rail. He had counted the way a buyer counts, which is to say, accurately. The count was 41, and he had known the count, and knowing the count meant he had come with a number already arrived at, and the number was $2, and the real number was $3.75 and rising. Della looked at him the way she looked at a cracked squash, assessing what was structural and what was just surface damage. She said she wasn't ready to sell the piglets and thanked him for coming out. He told her she was making a mistake. She told him she'd made notes of the market figures and expected they'd be about right by summer. He left in his good buggy, and she watched him go from the pen rail and then turned back to her 41 pigs and the 4 sows who were running this particular enterprise, and she felt something she had not let herself feel much since October, which was the quiet, settled satisfaction of a woman who has done the arithmetic and found that the numbers agree. She was not yet done with Greer, but she was done with him for the moment. She had work to do. Spring advanced, and with it, the piglets. They moved out of the barn and into the muddy bottomland pen with the energy of creatures discovering that the world is larger than they'd been told, and Bess, who continued to appear every day with the regularity of sunrise, oversaw their social arrangements with the authority of a small person who has named every individual in a group and therefore feels personally responsible for them. The bottomland, that gray cracked clay, that had frustrated Della's father across 20 years of trying to grow grain in it, turned out to suit pigs with a generosity that almost looked like apology. The wallows were natural, fed by the underground water Della had noted in October. The willow scrub provided shade. The river-bottom soft ground was easy on their feet. The clay itself, worked by their rooting, began to open up and breathe in a way that surprised Della. She had not expected the land to change under the pigs, but it did, the way land always changes under the animal that is right for it. By May she had 16 healthy shoats ready to sell. Not 41, she had held back the most promising 12 females as the start of a breeding herd, which was the arithmetic she had worked through in February and reworked in March, and which came out the same every time. You sell what you can afford to sell and keep what earns you next year and the year after. She drove 16 shoats to the Alderton market herself, in her wagon, arriving at 7 in the morning before the buyers had finished their coffee. A livestock buyer she had not met before, a younger man named Holt, who worked independent and bought for 3 or 4 different concerns, walked along the wagon, looked at her stock, and asked their breeding. She told him. He asked their winter history. She told him that too, and watched his eyebrows move. He offered her $3.60 per head. She said $3.85, and held the number with the same quality she'd held the $12 for the squash load. He paid $3.80. She drove home with $60.80, the 16 head, at $3.80, enough to retire her $60 note to the Granger lending house nearly to the penny, which she did the following week. She paid the note off on a Thursday afternoon with coins counted out on the lending house counter, and the man behind the counter looked at the coins and then at Della and said, somewhat unexpectedly, that he was glad to see it. She said she expected she was too, which made him smile, which surprised them both. June came in warm and wet, which suited the bottomland and the pigs, and the plans Della had made for expanding the pen along the river bend before autumn. She had kept 12 young sows. She had the 4 matriarchs, Queen and Agnes and Mud and Persimmon, each of whom was pregnant again, the boar loan from Václav having been renewed in the spring. She had the beginnings of something that was, by the accounting she did in the evenings, no longer a marginal operation. She had also begun to have visitors of a different kind than Calvin Greer. Harlan Teague came in the middle of June. He was a big man, made smaller by the winter, and he came without his customary directness, which told Della everything she needed to know about the nature of his visit before he opened his mouth. He had lost 80% of his herd. He had notes coming due in September. He had a wife and 4 children, and had too much pride to say plainly what he'd come to say. So he said it sideways, asking about pig prices and her operation, and how she'd managed the winter. And Della listened to all of it, and then said, plainly and without ceremony, "I have 4 shoats I haven't moved yet. You can have them at cost, $3 a head." Teague went still. That was below the market by better than 75 cents a head. He said he couldn't ask her to do that. She said he hadn't asked. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was complicated by the memory of things he had said in Boyle's store. And then he said, "That's decent of you, Miss Marsh." She said, "Don't tell Greer the price." He laughed, which was not something she had heard Harlan Teague do before, and it changed his face considerably. He bought the 4 shoats at $3 each, and paid cash, and shook her hand, and left. It was in July that Calvin Greer came back, and this time he did not come alone. He came with a man from the Alderton packing concern, a man whose name on the contract documents Della would later read was J.R. Aldous, and J.R. Aldous had a leather briefcase and the manner of someone who considered the briefcase sufficient introduction. They arrived at midday when the heat was full on the bottomland, and the pigs were contentedly wallowing in mud that was about the right temperature for a pig to wallow in. Greer had the confident manner back, the full version, and he explained, in the charitable-sounding way he had, that the Aldous concern was interested in establishing a supply contract with valley producers, and that they were prepared to offer a premium to reliable producers who could guarantee volume and quality, and that they were particularly interested, given the winter losses, in producers who had demonstrated the ability to carry sows through cold months. The offer was a flat contract, $2.80 per head, guaranteed, paid in 30 days, minimum 50 head per delivery, 3 deliveries per year. Greer presented this as a gift. Della looked at the contract. She read it the way she read everything, fully and without hurry, while Greer and Aldous stood in the sun in their good coats and became gradually less comfortable. She noted the payment terms, 30 days, which meant she would carry the cost for 30 days on every delivery. She noted the minimum 50 head, which was manageable now, but would chain her to a production schedule that served Aldous more than it served her. She noted the price, $2.80. The Alderton market that week was $3.85. A contract at $2.80 was a price that worked for J.R. Aldous and worked for Calvin Greer, and did not, by any honest arithmetic, work for Della Marsh. She looked up from the contract, and she said, in the plain and settled voice she had arrived at somewhere between October and now, "I sell at market price or I don't sign." Aldous said the contract price was the market price for contract supply, which was a different thing from spot market. Della said she understood the distinction, and it was still $1.05 under spot, and she was not interested. Greer's easy manner developed a thin place, and through the thin place she could see the other thing underneath it, which was the calculation he'd been running since March, which was that she needed the contract more than he needed her. He said, a single producer on her own couldn't sustain 50 head per delivery without the guaranteed income of a contract. She needed the certainty. He said the word alone the way he'd said someone in her position back in March, with a particular weight that he expected to be felt. Della looked at him for a moment without moving. Then she said, "I sold 25 head this spring on the spot market." She said it once, quietly, and left it where it fell. Greer and Aldous looked at each other. J.R. Aldous picked up his briefcase and told Greer they'd discuss the terms and be in touch. They were not in touch. Greer was. He came back 2 weeks later, alone, without the briefcase or the manor, and offered her $360 guaranteed. She said $380 with payment in 15 days. He said he'd need to go back to Aldous. She said she expected he would. He came back the following week with $375 in 15 days, and she signed that contract and filed it in her father's old account box under her floor, alongside the tin that had once held $22 and now held considerably more. August came, and the Bottomland ran with the energy of an enterprise that had found its proper shape. Della had 16 bred sows going into the fall. The 4 originals, Queen, who had produced 11 and then 10, Agnes, Mud, and Persimmon, moved through the bottomland with the deliberate authority of animals who have earned their position. The younger sows, the 12 she'd kept back from the spring farrowing, were beginning to show their first pregnancies, which represented, by Della's arithmetic, something in the neighborhood of 120 piglets by February at conservative rates. She had rebuilt the barn's north wall entirely with timber. She cut herself from the willow tangle and chinked with a clay mixture that Václav had refined for her, a proper insulating compound that he had brought from his own country's knowledge and had never before thought to share because no one had before thought to ask. She had put up a second pen along the river bend, properly railed with new timber, and she had hired Bess's older brother, who was 15 and strong and needed the work, for 2 days a week through harvest. The squash came back too because Della had thought about squash for a year and had arrived at a conclusion. She drove to Alderton on the second Saturday of October, just as she had the year before, and she found Prosper Fenn at the end of his market day with a wagon of cracked and split winter squash. He recognized her. He said before she could speak, "I've heard about your operation." She said she supposed he might have. He named a price first, this time, $15 for the load. She could see he'd thought about it. She said $13.50. He said $14. She said $13.50 again, quietly. And Fenn, who was a practical man and a farmer, and therefore understood that a thing is worth what the only buyer for it will pay, took $13.50. She loaded her wagon and drove back up the valley, and this time there was no one at Boyle's store window who thought anything much of it, because it was understood in Granger County by this October that Della Marsh was buying squash, and it was understood why. And the understanding had arrived at most people's faces in a posture of retrospective wisdom, as if they had seen it coming all along. They had not. But it is easier to believe a thing was obvious than to admit you were wrong to call it rotten, and so the town told itself it had always known, and Della did not argue the point, because being right was its own kind of reply. The second winter was cold, but not as cold as the first, and it did not need to be harsh to prove what it proved, because Della's operation was no longer a thing that required harsh conditions to validate it. She went into February with 16 sows in healthy condition, all of them bred, all of them carrying the evidence of 2 full months of squash and corn ration in their rounded sides and their thick coats, and the calm and somewhat imperious way they moved through the straw. Queen was 4 now, and still the largest, and still the leader, and when she turned her notch-eared head and regarded Della in the lamplight on those cold February mornings, there was something in the quality of that gaze that Della had stopped being surprised by, which is to say, she had accepted that Queen was, in her own estimation, a person of consequence, and that the feeling was not entirely mistaken. The farrowing of that second winter produced 109 piglets from 16 sows, against Della's conservative estimate of 112, which she had known was optimistic when she wrote it. 109 was a real number. 109 piglets in a chinked and banked barn in a cold February, from 16 sows who had eaten well and slept warm and been watched over across the fall and winter by a woman who had learned in a year and a half to read this land and these animals the way her father had never managed to read them. The debt was gone. The tin box under the floor held $137, which was not wealth by any scale the valley used, but which was entirely different in character from $22, because $22 is what you start with, and $137 is what you have made. Bess came before school and after school every day and named every piglet, and the 15-year-old brother worked 2 days a week and had begun, under quiet instruction from Della, to understand the arithmetic of the operation, well enough to suggest a modification to the feeding schedule that Della considered for 3 days and then adopted, because it was a good suggestion, and she was the kind of person who adopted good suggestions regardless of their origin. On a morning in late February, after the last of the farrowing and before the real loosening of the cold, Václav Horak came over and drank coffee in Della's kitchen and looked out the window at the bottomland where the older shoats moved through the mud and the snow, and he said the thing he had said before, not as repetition, but as a completion, the way a bookend makes sense only when the book is full. He said, "The land tells you what it wants to grow. You only have to be quiet enough to hear it." He looked at Della's hands around her coffee cup, the palms rough as bark now, the knuckles thickened by a year and a half of rail work and cold mornings and feed pails. He said, "You heard it." It was not a compliment exactly. It was something more like a recognition. Della looked out the window at the bottomland her father had called more trouble than it was worth, and she considered the 40 acres of low, wet, cracked bottomland that had in it underground water and natural wallows and willow timber and clay that could be mixed with straw into good insulating compound and room enough for the pigs that the land, if you listened, had been asking for since before her father had broken himself trying to grow wheat in it. She thought about the 900 squash and the $12 and the 4 Poland China sows of no fashionable breeding, and the barn she had chinked herself, and the 41 piglets born in the coldest January in 11 years, and the contract she had signed at $3.75 in 15 days, and the 109 piglets sleeping in the straw right now with Bess somewhere among them. Naming. She thought about Greer and Aldous and their briefcase and their 280. She thought about Ennis Boyle's store window. She thought about Harlan Teague's face when she'd said $3, the way something complicated had moved across it and then resolved into something simpler. She thought about the arithmetic, all the arithmetic, every number she had counted in the dark on the bad nights, all the survival math that she had run and rerun and refused to despair at. And she thought about what it added up to, not wealth, not ease, not the end of hard winters or early mornings or cold hands or the 1,000 small calculations that a farm demands of the person who means to keep it honest, but something real, something she had made from cracked squash and wet clay and the willingness to be quiet long enough to hear what the land was telling her. She set down her coffee cup and said, to Václav, and to the window, and to the bottomland, and to no one in particular, I expect we're just getting started. And outside, in the mud and the last of the winter light, 109 pigs agreed.